Okay. So I posted forms survey in the chat. If anybody hadn't seen it, go and fill that out. I want to cater this to the audience as much as possible, and you can fill that out while I talk about myself on this screen. I'm Michael Ochs, Executive VP at Exalents. We are a group of developers primarily that do Dynamics 365 or CDS Power Apps implementations. Also a business applications MVP. You can find me, I'm primarily a developer, so I spend most of my time writing code. Recently, I spend most of my time in meetings. I would prefer to be writing code, and I'm kind of an aspiring low-code developer. So I've been doing Dynamics, Microsoft CRM since 2005, and primarily writing code. And the low-code kind of environment came about more recently, and I'm still learning that. So it's kind of a shift for me. So, but today we're going to talk about virtual entities. I'm going to actually show a low-code, potentially no-code solution to implementing virtual entities inside of CDS and Dynamics 365. So I'd like to get your feedback on what it is you want to see. What do you know about virtual entities? And we'll kind of go through what they're useful for. So this is the agenda. Essentially, what are they good for? What are the limitations of virtual entities, and then some scenarios that you could use virtual entities in, as well as the majority of this is going to be a demo session, and then we'll have QA at the end. So I'm going to switch over real quick, and we'll see what we got as far as our responses. So we have a pretty even split here, right? We've got no knowledge of virtual entities. I know them. I've seen them, but I haven't implemented, and it looks like we're looking for primarily low-code solutions. So that's good. And then we've got pro-code solutions. So I may shift a little bit and focus on some more of the code behind the scenes. And then how awesome, I mean, like 10 responses, 5 out of 5. I think you guys might have ranked me a little too high on this one. So, but I appreciate that. Thank you. It gives me confidence. All right, so that's me. That's not what I was, here we go. Go to this one, start from here. It's weird. Not sure why it's doing that. All right, so let me bring this up. All right, so virtual entities. So virtual entities are essentially data that is surfaced in a model-driven app primarily, but it can be surfaced in a Canvas app. It can be surfaced in Power BI. It can be surfaced pretty much anywhere, but it's a CDS concept, so a common data service concept, whereby you're not actually storing the data that you're displaying in CDS. You're kind of intercepting the messages from CDS. You're creating the schema in CDS, and then you're intercepting the messages to retrieve that data. So an example is, I want to see, all of the, the sales orders from my SQL database that's on-prem or online, but I don't want to store that data, and I don't want to create an integration that relies on me syncing that data from my SQL database to my CDS instance. I just want to be able to surface that data. I want it to look like it lives in CDS, but I don't want to store it there. And one of the reasons that you would want to do that is cost savings. So primarily, virtual entities are great for cost savings. The CDS has gone to a consumption model licensing. So your depending on the number of users you have and the the basis for your CDS instance, you only have so much data that you can store in CDS. And virtual entities provide a way of storing data in cheaper storage, like SQL in Azure or Azure SQL or on-prem SQL, without actually storing that data in CDS. So you can surface that data and allow people to read it and act on it without actually storing that data in CDS. Decreased API usage, that's the same thing, kind of the idea that you don't have to build an integration that pushes data into CDS or pulls data into CDS. So again, the consumption model that Microsoft has introduced for the API, is also a reason why you would want to use virtual entities as opposed to building an integration that actually pushes data into your CDS instance. As far as the second column goes, simpler integration, no data duplication. When you build an integration that pulls data out of another system and into CDS, you're basically duplicating data that you don't necessarily need to. So you don't have to handle the trigger-based events where a record gets updated in a SQL database or whatever it may be, whatever your data store is, and replicate that over to CDS. Native functionality, these virtual entities are first-class entities, so you can run flows on them. You can use them for reporting. You can, you can basically do all of the things that you would do with a regular entity that was storing data in CDS, and so you have that full support. And initially what people were doing, and this is kind of like this concept kind of grew out of the community. So people were actually building virtual entities before there were virtual entities. People were building entities and then capturing the retrieve multiple on the plugin side and surfacing data from separate systems before Microsoft actually introduced it. So but it is now a fully supported way of surfacing data from external systems into CDS, Power Apps, etc. Some of the limitations, so it is currently read-only. I think there are plans to make it read-write at some point. I've heard rumblings of that. I'm not sure. Microsoft may make a decision either way on that because obviously they're reaping the benefits of having the data that needs to be read-write is kind of stored in CDS, and they're reaping the benefits a little bit of the cost structure there. Some of the additional limitations, there's actually a site you can go to, and this doesn't cover all of them, but no user team ownership. Everything is organizationally owned. If you create a virtual entity, it's organizationally owned. Everybody can see it. You can still lock it down on an entity by entity basis and say, I want these teams or these users to be able to see this entity, but you can't actually own a virtual entity. So you can't assign it to a specific user or team. There's no auditing, change tracking. Kind of makes sense. This is data that's kind of coming out of a separate system, so you can't necessarily tell when it's been updated or created or etc. There's limited connectors right now, and what I'm going to show today is, sorry, I'm just looking at the chat and see if there's any questions. There's limited connectors. OData is the only out-of-the-box connector right now, and OData is pretty good, and you can actually create, if you have a data store like SQL, or maybe it's an Azure file storage or Azure storage of some sort, you create an OData application on top of that using the entity framework. But you have to build an application, you have to deploy it as a web app, and there's limited capabilities there. The OData connector is good at what it does, but you have to have an OData source that actually maps one-to-one with the what the OData connector is expecting. The other connectors require code, third-party solutions. I don't know how many people are using virtual entities in production environments today, but I would say it's probably limited just based on the amount of connectors that are available. And I'll show today, I'll actually show I'll show how the OData connector works, the out of the box connector versus a custom connector. And then additional limitations, these are 3 of the probably like 5 or 6 that you can find on the web, but it does require a GUID as a primary key. If you're familiar with CDS, obviously all of the records in CDS are identified by GUIDs, and the connectors expect the ID to be a GUID. We'll look at how we can actually get around that today with a custom connector. There's no calculated rollup fields, no activity queue or business process support. These are essentially, intended to be kind of reporting entities, right? So it's read-only data that's surfaced in the same canvas as your application. So you can't actually act on these types of entities. All right, so scenarios, obviously surfacing external data, we talked about that, reporting data. So there's scenarios that I won't get into today, but if you want to follow up with me, this came out of a sort of a requirement from one of our customers this whole session, and the custom connector I'm going to show you today came out of a requirement from one of our customers, which was, we realized that there's a limitation on the amount of data that we want to store inside of CDS, but we've got all this data that people want to see, and we've got different ways that they want to see it. So can you create a mechanism where we can use cheaper storage to show the data? We don't need to edit it. We just want to show it. And can we also kind of enrich or report on that data, get aggregates of that data and things like that using or through a way without having to store it in CDS. And so what we ended up doing was we created a SQL virtual entity provider, and we also created some virtual entities that did aggregates in real time. So you could do that through an entity and do rollups, rollup fields and things like that inside of CDS. But the problem is you're not getting real-time data. So what they wanted was real-time data that was surfaced in CDS, Power Apps, and was aggregates of information that was pulled from SQL. So you can actually do that with virtual entities by creating, either you've got a connector to external data, but you can also create SQL virtual entities that do that aggregation and display that information. So the third thing is you can enrich the data, right? So you can actually reach out to other APIs and things like that and get information that would potentially augment the data that you have in CDS. So what we're going to look at today, since we've got mostly low code pro codes online, is we're going to actually look at some of the source code for a custom virtual entity provider. We're going to also look at, a kind of plug and play virtual entity data provider. And primarily, we're going to look at a SQL based virtual entity provider, and if that sounds good, I can also run through the OData provider. If anybody's interested, let me know. I could do that first. That's pretty quick. If anybody's interested in seeing that and kind of the baseline virtual entity provider. All right, I'm gonna jump in. All right, so
let's go.
Who's that? All right, so I'm going to jump into a couple of things we need. Obviously, we need a CDS instance, a model-driven app. I'm going to do this from model-driven apps today. We're going to see how we can surface this data out of SQL, and I'll also show the OData connector. So I've got a blank CDS environment here, NYC 2020. I'm going to create a new solution. We'll call this virtual entities. All right. So all of this needs to happen in the classic editor. Andrew brought that up earlier. There's a lot of things that aren't available in the new Maker experience. So the majority of the virtual entity stuff is still in the classic editor. So we're going to switch to classic. And essentially what we're going to do, I'll go ahead and start with the OData. So here's an OData instance of advertisements that's published out there. It's a demo environment or a sample environment.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
I think you're presenting a different screen.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Is that good?
It's different.
Okay. Do you see a bunch of XML?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll start with this. This is essentially a kind of demo site. It's got advertisements with a couple of records and things like that. This is the example of the out-of-the-box OData virtual entity. So if you have an OData service, luckily this one has the IDs are GUIDs, as we were talking about earlier. So that's good. The majority of the data sources I've worked with outside of CDS generally don't use GUIDs, but this one works because it is a GUID. So let's go ahead and create a virtual entity for this. Sorry, wrong window. All right, so here's our demo environment. I'm going to create a new entity. Give it a second. Or two. There we go. All right, so this is going to be advertisements. Call it advertisement, and then advertisements. We're going to mark it as a virtual entity. We don't have a data source currently, so we actually need to create a data source first. So let's go back. And I'm going to go to apps. I'm just going to open up default app. Go to advanced settings. Go to administration. So the first thing you need to do to create a virtual entity is you have to actually set up a data source. So you have to tell it where it's going to get that data from. So under the administration section, again, we're in the classic interface. A lot of the stuff is not exposed on the new interface yet. Click virtual entity data sources. There's a couple in here that are Microsoft based, and they come installed with the base environment. If I click new, it's going to load and load and load. There's lots of load there. All right, so we want an OData v4 data provider. Click OK. It's going to load. There we go. All right, so this is our add OData provider. And the URL for this I got from, go back here. So the URL I got from here. So this is the service that's going to expose the data that we want to see. That looks good. Pagination mode. This one, I'm still working with this one as far as how best to handle this. So client-side paging means get me all the data, and when I click on page 2 of that data, so I've got 50 records in my view. If I click on page 2, that means that the virtual entity provider actually went out and got all the data. So if there's 1,000 records, it went out and got all the data. Client-side paging means I'll go ahead and take the 1,000 records and then I'll page it as required. Server-side paging is for if you have 1 billion records, 1 million records, 100 million records. You want to do server-side paging because you don't want to put that burden on your CDS instance or your Power Apps instance to pull back 1 billion records and then page it that way. So that's what this is for. As far as creating custom providers, which we'll get into later, I haven't quite figured out how best to implement that. So if anybody has any ideas, I know if Andrew's still online. Andrew's been doing a lot with virtual entities in the past, so maybe he has some insight and he can offer that up at the end. But anyway, for now, so this is our provider. We'll go ahead and save this. Close. All right, and let's go back to our entity. Probably have to refresh this. This is advertisement. Advertisements. This is a virtual entity, and we're going to pick our add OData provider. All right, so a couple more things we have to do here. There's an external name, so we need to give it a name. If we look back at our, apologize, got a lot of windows open here. If we look back here, our entity name is advertisements. So that's the specific record that we're trying to, excuse me. That's the specific records that we're trying to retrieve. Put that in here. Advertisements, external collection name is the same. And then primary field, we need to, so basically what we're doing is we're creating an entity inside of CDS, but we're mapping it directly to this OData source. So we also have to map our fields, so name. If we look at this again, we can probably find what the, yeah, so it's got I think it's got a name in here. Let's see. There we go. Yep. So it's got an attribute called name. That's going to be our primary attribute. Call that name. And then save that. And then the only thing we have to do now is map the ID field. Any questions while we're waiting for the for this to spin? Yeah, I'm not sure why this is taking so long. All right, give me 1 second. Okay. All right, let's go to fields. Nope, that one's spinning too. Come on. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, here we go. So advertisement ID, let's go ahead and map this. And we'll map it to our OData, which has a GUID. Let's see, I think it's called ID. Capital ID. All right. Okay. So now we'll go ahead and publish this. And if we jump back over to our environment, create a new app. We're going to call this a model-driven app. Give it a name, say done, and let's configure this. So we're going to select an entity. In particular, we want advertisements. That looks good. Call it ads. Save and publish. And then we'll go ahead and play. It should work if I did everything correctly. It did not. What did I miss? Let's see. Let's go back to solutions, virtual entities, advertisements, and switch to classic. So we got advertisements as the collection name. Primary field is name, and fields are, let's look at the ID, is ID. Let's just verify that again. Category was ID. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay. Not 100% sure what happened there. External name is ID. Name is name. Might be our, let's see if we can All right, let's move on from this one. I'm going to show you the, I'll actually, in the interest of time, I'll move on from this one. I'm not sure what happened there. But we'll take a look at the SQL provider. So, so that was the out of the box OData provider. What I mentioned in the initial PowerPoint was that a lot of the other providers are custom providers, and what's out there right now is kind of limited. But I actually created a direct SQL virtual entity data provider that would give you the ability to query SQL directly as opposed to an OData endpoint. And the benefit of this is if you're trying to get data out of an Azure SQL or an on-prem SQL instance, you need to put something in front of that SQL instance to be able to, if you wanted to use the OData provider that's out of the box, you have to put an application in front of your SQL instance in order to use the OData provider. The benefit of this provider is that it goes directly to SQL, and it does a direct connection, and it actually interpret all the fetch XML and things like that come out of CDS into SQL. So I'm going to run through this real quick, and I'm actually going to install this in our, I'm going to install this in our test organization. So if I run back here, go to solutions, I'm going to import this. I can import this from GitHub. So if I go to GitHub, go to SQL virtual entity providers, I have a blog up about this that has this link. But if I drill into SQL virtual entity providers and solutions, I've got a sample provider. I've also got the generic provider in here, and the managed and unmanaged application or solution. I've also got all the source code in here if you're interested in looking at it. So I'm going to take this one and import it into our environment. There we go. And then while that's importing, I'm going to go out to Azure. So I've got a SQL instance or an Azure SQL instance in Azure. I've got this SQL database, the SQL virtual entity test. I've got this that's running on this server. So if we look at this, you can actually get the connection string from here. If you import the solution, you'll need to replace the password with your password. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. Okay. That didn't help. All right, here we go. All right, so solution imported. If I go back to our environment, and go to NYC 2020. All right, so when I imported that solution, it created this app, the Azure SQL product catalog sample. If you go out, if you read the blog post that I created, it'll show you how to actually set this up. So you can create a sample database inside of Azure SQL and kind of get this up and running to get kind of a understanding of how it works. If we open this right now, you'll see there's products and product categories. It's going to fail. If we look at the database in the background, we've got products, we've got product categories, we've got sales orders, sales order details, and etc. This one does have a row GUID. What we're actually doing in this SQL provider is using the product ID and not the row GUID. I'll show you after this how that works, and a little bit of the code if we can just push through this. So, all right, so this failed. The reason this failed is because we haven't set up our data source yet. So if you go to Advanced Find, go to SQL Providers, when you import the solution, it's going to create a SQL provider configuration. And all you need to do is actually paste that in. So that connection string we got from Azure, paste in here after you replace your password. Save and close. Click that again. There we go. So what you're seeing is the actual data out of this product catalog, including the product category. Apologies. Including the product categories. So there's a end-to-one lookup between product and product category in the solution that we created, or in the sample solution, and it's actually handling, what these categories are based on their product category ID, not based on the row GUID. Since we got started a little bit late, I'll walk through this really quick. The specifics of the solution. So let's go to edit. No, we can't do that. Sorry. Done. Solutions. Let's go to the sample and switch to classic. All right. So what's in the solution is the app, the Azure SQL product catalog sample. The solution I imported was the sample solution. There is a solution out there for you to import that doesn't include the app. It doesn't include product or product category. It just basically provides the provider. So if you want to import that and start, creating your own virtual entities, you can do that. I probably won't be able to drill into these, I guess. Oh, there we go. All right, so the product entity uses the SQL product provider configuration. The external name is actually the name of the table, as well as the namespace for the database. So if you're creating an Azure SQL instance or a SQL on-prem SQL instance, if you have that prefix, you need to specify that prefix. Primary field here is name. If you look at fields, we've got product ID, which is the primary key. Can't drill into that. Let me go back to sorry. Here we go. All right, product fields. All right, so this is product category ID. We're pulling that from the product table. And then we also have a lookup to, sorry, that is the lookup. So there's a lookup to product category. There's also the product or product ID, which is pulling from product ID. The solution actually handles integer values as well as GUID values. So if you have an identifier in your SQL database that is not a GUID, then you can actually use a numeric value. So the majority of the SQL instances I've seen out there in the legacy environment are generally they use an auto number field that is kind of self-incrementing, and the limitation of the virtual entities to use GUIDs is usually not ideal, but the provider will actually convert a numeric field into a GUID. So that's pretty much it. So I think we're about out of time. Is that correct, Eric? We had our.
You're just about there.
Okay. All right. So any questions? Anything I can show additional to what I just showed? I can show the code off a little bit if you guys want to see it. It's up to you. Anything specific about the presentation?
Mike, I had one question.
Sure.
So with the virtual entities, I think I heard you say that we can trigger if Power Automate and also do reporting on it using Power BI.
Yep. Yeah. So they're essentially first-class entities, right? So if you wanted to pull out a virtual entity into Power BI, you may not be able to store it locally. I don't know. That would be an interesting test to do, but you can interact with it through the APIs like you would any other entity. So if you were querying for a contact versus a virtual contact, you can query for it through the APIs just like any other entity. It's going to give you back the data that you expect. So you can export it to Excel, and do all those things. It really doesn't treat it any different except for those specific limitations of the audit history and the the ownership and things like that. So as soon as you query for that entity or that record, it's going to execute the code behind to actually pull it from the data source that you're looking for.
So,
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question about if the SQL Server is on-prem instead of Azure SQL, right? Is there any way to use your provider that you just demoed, or we have to upload this into Azure SQL?
So this is the provider is using ADO.NET. It's not, there's no magic behind it. So if you can connect to your on-prem SQL instance using SQL Management Studio, or if you can connect to it with a generic application, then you can absolutely use this. So there's really not anything special happening behind the scenes. The way I set up the SQL database that we have in Azure SQL, it's allowing Azure resources to access it. You may need to open up an IP address or something like that. You may need to have a
data gateway, maybe
a gateway installed on the SQL Server. Yeah, exactly. But ultimately, all this provider is doing is using ADO.NET and a connection string to connect to the database. So any way that you can connect to the database outside of your network, you could do with the provider.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Thank you.
Hey, Michael, Kunal here. Can we do join, etc. within plugin code to a virtual entity?
You can. So I didn't mention it, but the ability to access SQL directly is pretty new to the online environment. So all of the virtual entity providers are registered as plugins, and those plugins are sandbox. And in the past, you couldn't actually do direct SQL connections. You could only do HTTP or HTTPS to connect to connect to external resources. very recently, Microsoft actually opened up the ability to do other types of connections. So you could, I haven't tried it, but you could probably actually do like FTP connections now. So the discovery for me was, the big discovery for me was I tried to do a direct SQL connection from a Microsoft online instance, and it went through fine. And so that's kind of a new capability. I don't think Microsoft has touted it, but yeah, you can pretty much do anything that you could do from SQL Management Studio at this point and this extends the provider, is one use case, but this really does extend to, apologies. I probably shouldn't have set an alarm for when the session ended. But the ability to connect directly to SQL from a plugin extends beyond the virtual entity provider. You can pretty much do anything now from a plugin that you want to do to directly to SQL using.
So you're referring TDS protocol endpoint, right, Michael? If I'm correct.
What's that?
TDS protocol endpoint you are referring, the direct SQL connectivity?
So the provider is a plugin essentially.
Okay.
So on Retrieve Multiple of the products, it executes a plugin, and we're using straight ADO.NET SQL connections directly into Azure SQL to surface that data. So you could do it like on create of a contact if you wanted to. You could push a contact to a SQL database now without any need to create a OData endpoint or an API to do that. So.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. Great. Great to know about virtual entities.
Thank you.
Yep.